Alrighty, so today we are going to talk about cooperation across cultures. We'll start with just a little note about the old final exam, which will be in class on the last day of the semester. And yeah, sorry. Good point. I was going to say I'm going to fix this so it'll be right for next time, but that's obviously stupid. Okay, so we'll be on Thursday. No, we have a surprise Wednesday class. Okay, so it'll be the last day of class, and the day before, or the day of class before, will be a review like it was before the midterm, and it will basically be the same format as the midterm. Some, probably 3 calculation problems and 3 short answer problems. And it's not cumulative in a strict sense, in that it will only be asking about material that we talk about in the second half of the class, but because of the structure of the class, in order to understand the stuff that happens in the second half, we're going to use all the tools from the first half. Okay, so today we're going to talk about culture and the role of culture in cooperation. And a natural question to start with when we're going to talk about culture is, what is culture? And I Googled it to find out. And I found it's a number of interesting definitions. So from this thing in blue, it's some website. Characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people defined by everything from language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. Another one is, culture is the cumulative deposit of knowledge, experience, beliefs, values, attitudes, meanings, hierarchies, religion, notions of time, roles, spatial relations, concepts of the universe, and material objects and possessions acquired by a group of people. So, a lot of stuff. But if we think about what culture is going to mean in terms of our sort of the game theoretic perspective that we're looking at, it's going to be much simpler just because the space of possible things that you could have is much simpler. It's basically going to boil down to beliefs and preferences. You can have variation in beliefs across groups, you can have variation in preferences across groups, and that can influence the way people play these games. And an important note about culture is, I've talked about a lot of experiments so far, and they basically have all been done with people in the US or in Western Europe. And there is this line of argument that is called this. So there's these 2 anthropologists who say that these standard subjects in academic papers are the weirdest people in the world, where weird is white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That is, the countries that basically everyone comes from in almost all social science experiments have those 5 characteristics. And what these guys argue is that rather than being standard or representative, that in some sense these weird cultures are the real outliers, certainly in the context of human history, and they would argue even in the context of a lot of of currently living humans. And so they make the argument that it's really important to not just study weird people, but to go elsewhere around the world and understand to what extent whatever behaviors you're interested in vary across cultures. And so we can ask from a kind of theory perspective, should culture matter? And if, as I was saying, if we want to think about how culture can enter into this sort of game theoretic framework, as I said a minute ago, it can either enter through beliefs or through preferences. But if you're in a kind of real classical, people are rational and self-interested kind of way of thinking about things, then there are no social preferences. If you just assume everyone is totally self-interested, then in situations, in games where there's only one equilibrium, like the prisoner's dilemma, beliefs don't matter. There's only one equilibrium, everyone should do the same thing. And so you might say, well, in this case, in these conditions, culture shouldn't matter. everyone should play a one-shot Prisoner's Dilemma the same way because there's only one sort of smart, reasonable thing to do there. But in games with multiple equilibria, like coordination games, now beliefs do matter. And so even if everyone is entirely self-interested, there's no differences in preferences, whatever, still here culture should play an important role because it can influence which coordination point a group winds up coordinating on. And so if you think if you're just sort of taking this classical approach, you say, okay, well, culture and beliefs should matter in coordination games, shouldn't matter in games that have only one equilibria. But as per the logic that we've been talking about in the last few classes, whereby people aren't totally rational, if you have these kind of intuitive, heuristic type responses that lead to spillovers from one context to another, that also means that culture can influence games that have only one equilibria, in so much as behavior that you develop in the context of coordination games can then spill over to influence what you do, through this channel of intuition and heuristics, can influence what you do in other games, even games where on their own have only one equilibria. I'm sorry that this is particularly harder to see than usual. I don't know what's going on with the projector. Can people see, is it so bad that I should stop and try and make it somehow further up on the screen? Yeah. Does anybody have any theories? Does it look like there's buttons on that thing you could push with a stick to make it stick? Or not?
Professor,
yes.
If you click escape and then make it
So you think we can move it down? But
It is presentation mode.
No, take it out of presentation mode so it comes up here.
Yeah, I don't know that is really gonna.
Does this just move it up and down?
Oh, that's the screen, I think. Hold on. Let's see, what is that thing?
Yeah, that just moves the screen.
Better or worse?
Is there a sentence below spillover? Isn't that the last sentence?
Yeah, that's the last. So that's the last sentence. But I think the people in the back can't see the last. The bottom is the problem, right? That's
nope. Shit.
Well, I don't know. I feel like we've been defeated by the technology, but I will try and make very clear what's happening down on the bottom. So it says, means culture can also influence games with only one equilibrium if coordination choices spill over, as per what I was just saying. So from a theory perspective, it seems like culture should definitely matter in the context of games with multiple equilibria, and there's some reason to expect that it should also matter even in games where there's only one equilibrium. And so then there's an empirical question of, does culture actually matter for behavior in these games? And the answer is, duh, yes. There are big cultural differences in the way people behave. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about sort of evidence of cross-cultural variation in behavior, and then we're going to talk about sort of one theoretical explanation for why such variation exists, and then what's going to happen in the problem set is you're going to explore two other potential explanations for why you would have stable cultural differences. Okay, so the frame that we're going to use for the empirical demonstration is a couple of different sets of really cool cross-cultural experiments that have been run by people. And so in one of them, and this is work by Benedict Hermann, that even the people in the front row can't see what that says. He's sort of like the Indiana Jones of experimental economics, where he would just go around to all these different countries where no one had anything, and he would just set up a lab for a week, run these experiments, and then go somewhere else. He's a really cool guy. I like him a lot. We ran experiments in Romania together when I was in grad school. That was fun. So what he did in this paper is they did a 10-round public goods game with college students in 15 different countries. Remember, the public goods game is like this multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, where in this case it was groups of 4 each person in each round of the game gets some money. They choose how much to keep for themselves and how much to contribute to the common project, where the contributions are multiplied by some factor and split evenly by everyone. So just like a prisoner's dilemma, if everyone contributes, everyone's better off because the money gets multiplied, but you optimize your payoff by not contributing yourself and sort of free riding off of the contributions of the others. And the way he picked these countries is he picked them to vary along dimensions of the extent to which they trust other people, and they have sort of basic norms of civic cooperation, things like not hopping the turnstile at the bus station, the train station, whatever, and also variations in the rule of law, that is sort of how corrupt versus strong the institutions are, and also GDP per capita. And so he sort of tried to span this space to say, well, okay, do people differ in how they play in these games? And so if the predictions from that is the straightforward prediction that everyone should agree on, is in games with multiple equilibria, it will make sense that you should have cultural differences because beliefs matter and can get you just sort of coordinated in different places. And so one of the sets of experiments he ran that we'll talk about first is a version of cooperation with punishment. So in this repeated public good game, after every round, you found that people found out what the other people in the group did and they could pay to punish them. And so this means that you can have a cooperative equilibrium in which everyone says we'll cooperate and punish free riders, and then you don't want to defect because if you do, you're going to get punished. But that's not the only equilibrium. You can also have an equilibrium where people aren't contributing and people aren't punishing. And as we'll see, people also can do even weird stuff with punishment. Or put more differently, punishment is a tool to enforce social norms, but as we saw in the midterm, that punishment tool can enforce whatever social norm you want. And so, given that norms vary, when you have punishment in place, you would expect to see a lot of variation. And indeed, what you see is there's a lot of variation in the amount of cooperation in the beginning of the game, and there's also a lot of variation at the end, and there's variation across these countries in like how the game unfolds. So basically, you can see that there's a bunch of these countries manage to coordinate on the sort of good, pretty cooperative equilibrium, even though they start in fairly dispersed. There's some chunk that coordinate up here, but then there's another chunk where basically the punishment doesn't help, and they more or less stay wherever they started, or even get a little bit worse off. And we're going to come back in a couple of slides to try and say what are the differences between, what determines whether a country is in one camp or the other. But just as some of these examples, you can see, so like up here you've got Boston, Copenhagen, Seoul, Zurich, Melbourne, Chengdu, which is in China, and St. Gallen, that's Switzerland. And then down here you've got like Athens, Riyadh, Istanbul, Muscat, and then a couple of, I think, former Soviet bloc countries. And so this sees that in terms of the way that the cooperation unfolds, there are these clear differences across countries. And in terms of the mechanism through which that happens, what we'll see is that they're using punishment differently in these different countries, and therefore incentivizing different kinds of behavior. And so the way that they break this up is they show the average amount of punishment for in each of these different cities for the amount of punishment that people direct at those that contributed less than them, which is sort of pro-social punishment. So they define punishing sort of comparatively low contributors as pro-social. And what you see is that basically more or less the same across countries. People that contributed a lot less than you, so the dark green, you punish a lot, and people that punish a bit less than you punish a bit. And now the question is, what happens to people that contributed the same amount as you, a little bit more than you, or a lot more than you? And what you see, so this is sort of, if you think about it, this is called, they call this antisocial punishment. So this is a interesting thing, right? This is saying someone else contributed more to the public good than you, so they reduce their own payoff relative to you in order to benefit you and the other people in the group. So like, why would you punish these people? And as you can guess from the positioning of the legend, there's going to be very little of this punishment in, for example, the US. But what you see is, although there's essentially no antisocial punishment in a lot of these weird countries, when you get down here into the countries that correspondingly had sort of not good cooperation outcomes in the game with punishment, it's seeing as also there is a lot of antisocial punishment going on. And in some of these places, there's actually more punishment of sort of cooperators than there is of defectors. And so this is indicative of there being some like clear differences in social norms across these countries around sort of what appropriate behavior in these settings are. In games with multiple equilibria, we do see this big cross-cultural variation. And as I said, sort of everyone should agree on that. But now the question is, what happens in the context of cooperation games without punishment? And so now this is more just this, you're just doing this public goods game. There's not really any enforcement mechanism. You should sort of basically expect that people are going to learn to defect. So is there actually any cross-cultural variation? And so if you look at cooperation in the first period of the sort of games without punishment, you see that there is a lot of variation. And sorry, here I switched from the city names back to the US names. But you can see that more or less it's following the same patterns. A lot of the sort of Western countries doing well in the beginning, and the sort of Middle Eastern or Soviet bloc countries doing worse, but it's not quite as well sorted. So that's just the same thing shown in the other format. But now if you look at what happens over time, it's basically the same everywhere. So even though there's variation in where they start, you get a tragedy of the commons thing happening across the board. That is basically in the situation where there's not any kind of mechanism in place to support cooperation. It doesn't matter where you're from. Basically, everybody's learning to defect. But there is this, substantial variation in where things start. And so now, if we want to look at what's going to predict this variation across countries in the extent to which they are able to maintain cooperation in the coordination game. And I should say also that if you look at just cooperation in the first period here, it's not perfect, but as I was sort of saying in the previous slide, it follows a similar pattern, and there is a strong correlation where the countries that use punishment in a more pro-social way and are able to sustain cooperation in the games with punishment, people from those countries also tend to be more cooperative in the beginning of this game, which is consistent with this kind of spillover idea that if you're in a place where you can get to good outcomes in the coordination games, that also makes you sort of more generally predisposed to behave in a cooperative way, even when there's not that kind of incentives in place. And so we want to understand what predicts the differences across countries in how well they're managing to get cooperation going on, and so therefore, because the punishment is determining how much people are cooperating, what's going to predict the extent to which you have this sort of pro-social versus antisocial punishment going on. And so, sorry, this is a regression table, but the key idea is that if you want to punish, so over here our regression model is predicting the amount of pro-social punishment of free riders that contribute less than you, and this is the predictors of the antisocial punishment. And what you can see is that places where people tend to be cooperative, so there are stronger norms of civic cooperation, people also are more inclined to punish selfishness, which sort of makes sense. And when you look at antisocial punishment, again, the more cooperative people tend to be, the less they are do the antisocial punishment. But I feel like this norms of civic cooperation is basically just restating the observation that people cooperate. That is basically saying the extent to which people cooperate in the games is predictive of how much they cooperate in real life. But that doesn't tell you that much about causality, like why are people being more cooperative. But what you see is that there's a strength of rule of law, that is, how non-corrupt are the institutions, how effectively do the institutions incentivize good behavior and disincentivize bad behavior. That is not really correlated with punishment of free riding, because regardless of how good the institutions are, basically everybody seems to be punishing the non-free riders, punishing the free riders. But the key thing here is the stronger the rule of law, the less corruption there is, the less likely people are to engage in this antisocial punishment, which in turn sort of derails cooperation. And so basically the take home from this paper was like good institutions seem to be correlated with people then in these kind of more private anonymous economic game situations behaving more pro-socially. Another piece of evidence that paints a similar picture comes from this sort of seminal work of Jill Henrich, who is actually even maybe more like Indiana Jones than Benedict, in that rather than going to his experiments with college students, he mostly works with small-scale societies. And so he has these like very influential papers where they did these economic games with hunter-gatherers and foragers and small-scale agricultural people and stuff like that. This is from one paper, an example of a bunch of the different groups that they went to. And so one of the things they did was a dictator game. So they do the dictator game with people from rural Missouri and then urban Missouri and lots of other places. They got the Emory freshmen in there. As well as various other weird, or I guess not, they're the weird ones, right? So in this case, the Emory freshmen and the people from Missouri are weird, and everybody else is not weird. And so what you're going to see is the fraction that people tend to give in the dictator game, and there are these like really confusing bubble plots that so the blue line in each one shows you the average, and then the dots are proportional to how the frequency of people across these different things. So if you look at the Emory freshman, it's saying sort of to an equal extent, people gave nothing, people gave 40%, and people gave 50%. And then somewhat less people gave 10% or 30%, and then very few people gave 20%, 60%, or 70%, and nobody gave above 70%. Also notice that these ends are all very small for any individual place, but overall there's this clear pattern where there's a substantial amount of variation. Although on the flip side, you could also say there's not anywhere that everyone is just being purely selfish and homo economicus type rational self-interest. Although if you look at who are the ones that are being the most selfish, it's the Emory freshmen and the Hadza. The Hadza are this hunter-gatherer group that are one of the sort of most studied of these groups. So again, this is in the form of documenting that there is substantial variation in giving, although giving is not unique to weird subject rules. But again, we want to say, okay, well, what explains this variation? And so what Henrich does is he also is in the sort of institutions play an important role in people's kind of internalized behavior, that is behavior in these situations where there's not any incentives to be cooperative. Again, the line of reasoning being if there's a good institution, institutions kind of create incentives that facilitate cooperation between people. In Benedict's case, he was looking at rule of law, so that's basically laws punishing people for exploiting each other, or by and large, maybe some amount of rewarding people for behaving well, but mostly I think it's punishing people for behaving poorly. And what Henrich focuses on in this one paper is market integration. That is to say, the percentage of the calories in your diet that you get through trade rather than by going out and finding yourself. And the idea is that markets are actually an institution that facilitates cooperation in the sense that, as when we were talking about examples of cooperation much earlier in the course, we had trade as an example where it can be mutually beneficial, but there's a temptation to exploit the other person by making a low-quality product for cheaper. And markets are supposed to protect against that kind of behavior, because if someone is making a bad product, then basically market forces are going to work against them, and sort of the market is supposed to work to sort of put pressure on everyone to produce good products. And so as a result, the idea is if you have a well-functioning market, it means that you can trust strangers such that like the thing that you're trying to sell me is in fact what is advertised. And so Henrik's idea is that the more market integrated you are, the more used to having interactions with strangers where you can trust the other stranger and where there's a force on you requiring you to behave in a trustworthy way. And therefore, more market integration should be associated with more pro-sociality in these sort of one-shot anonymous settings. And indeed, that's what he finds in this paper. So you've got places with lots of market integration like the US being pro-social. Down at the Hadza are 100%, they have no market integration, they're only hunter-gatherers, and they are like much more selfish, and then everything in between. What this work and Benedict's work and a lot of other work suggests is that there's this correlation where strong institutions, or rather the strength of institutions, tends to co-vary across cultures with the extent to which people behave cooperatively, even in situations where they don't have to. That is, the extent to which people have internalized norms of cooperation that say the right thing to do is to cooperate. And so the question then is, what's the direction of causality? Is it that you need to have good norms of cooperation in place in order to support good institutions? Because if people aren't, if people at baseline are going to be selfish, then either they won't support institutions or they won't favor institutions that enforce cooperativeness, or when those institutions are set up, they won't actually implement them because they'll be corrupt or whatever. Or is it the opposite direction of causality, which is to say having a good institution creates in people norms of cooperation by sort of encouraging pro-social behavior? And probably both of these things happen to some extent, but if we want to think, with the tools that we've assembled so far of which of these should we expect to really be going on, our ease-flexibility trade-off from a few lectures ago gives some insight into it. Remember, the idea here is that you have these automatic intuitive responses that are cognitively effortless, but in exchange aren't very sensitive to the details of the situation, or you can engage in, you can sort of pay some cognitive cost to think carefully about the situation that you're facing. And we talked about how this can lead to this idea of social heuristics, where the behavior that is typically optimal in the long run winds up getting internalized as this intuitive default, like a social heuristic or like rule of thumb for social interaction, whereas deliberation then can make you say, well, what should I actually be doing here? And so if you apply this lens to culture, what it suggests is that if you're in a place where you have good, strong institutions that sanction defection, create disincentives to exploit other people, that makes it so that cooperation is typically paying off because the institution is rewarding you for cooperating or punishing you for defecting, which means that people should get in the habit of typically being cooperative and therefore sort of develop a social heuristic that says cooperation is the advantageous thing to do. They internalize that, and then they wind up being cooperative, even in situations where there's no formal rules there saying you have to cooperate, which creates a culture of cooperation. And then in places where there are weak institutions, where there's a lot of corruption, where there's not sanctions in place to stop you from defecting, the opposite is true. Defecting pays off, and sort of defection winds up getting internalized as people's default way of operating. And so what I'm going to do now for the next chunk of this is provide some experimental evidence in direct support of this sort of interpretation of the basis of cultural differences.
When did they explain the freshman at Emory? Because weren't they like the second most selfish group?
Yeah, so a general feature that has been found in sort of meta-analyzing a lot of these games is that undergrads are way more selfish than regular adults. And so, one possibility is that, from a sort of development values and behavior and internalization of norms perspective, you guys aren't done cooking yet. Another possibility is that I think the sort of economic conditions that undergrads find themselves in are sort of not that representative in terms of, by and large, undergrads, like, even to the extent that you have second jobs, you're not really supporting yourself. And so I think the demand for, or the desire to keep the money is higher than for sort of people that are actually working. So it's a good point, but I think it's some sort of idiosyncrasy of students rather than some reflection of sort of culture in general. And I'll show you some, actually, none of what I'm going to show you is with students, but I've done a similar thing with students and it looked similarly, so I will say that when it happens. Okay, so you don't have to, so far we've looked across countries and even across sort of scale of societies, but you can see some evidence of the same thing even within a country. So we did this experiment recruiting people online from all over the US, where we wanted to measure how the quality of their sort of local institutions predicted their generosity in the dictator game. Remember, the dictator game is just you have the amount of money, how much do you want to keep for yourself versus give to the other person, and the other person just has to accept it. So it's just a unilateral money-giving game. And so what we did here, which is it's not perfect, but we used as a proxy for the quality of the institutions on sort of like the good behavior enforcing institutions in your community, basically just a self-report where we ask people how good are the institutions in your location, and in particular sort of how much confidence do you have in the courts and how much do you have confidence in the police, which are sort of the two main institutions for disincentivizing bad behavior. And so in one experiment with 700 people, we found this positive correlation where in particular the people from places where they said that the police and the courts were really not working effectively were also less pro-social. And then we replicated it again with a much bigger sample, and this is something that looks maybe at least a little bit more linear. And you can control for all kinds of things that you might worry co-vary with confidence in police and courts, including gender, age, ethnicity, religion, education, income, and fiscal and social conservatism. And you still have some evidence of this same relationship where sort of exposure to better institutions makes people more pro-social. And in particular, we also show that the mechanism is that the greater confidence you have in the police and courts, the more you think that people that you tend to interact with in your daily life are trustworthy. And that, in turn, leads to you giving more in these games. And so this is sort of our proxy for how good are the institutions. This is our proxy for how cooperative are people typically. And then this is our measure for what's your resulting behavior. And so this is sort of consistent with that story, but it's a correlation, and this is maybe not the best measure for institutional quality anyways. So then we also want direct experimental evidence showing how manipulating the quality of the institution that people experience influences their subsequent prosociality. And so we wanted to do an experiment where we randomly reassign people to live in different cities for a year and see what happened. Couldn't get it through the IRB, so instead we did a lab game where we had people play 10 rounds of a public goods game. And so it's, in each round of the game, everyone gets 140 units. They decide how much to keep, how much to contribute. The contributions are multiplied by 1.2 and split 3 ways. So if everyone contributes, everyone increases their money. But for every dollar you put in, you only get back 1.2 over 3, so 0.4. And so that means you're losing money on any individual dollar you're putting in. So standard sort of prisoner's dilemma, multiplayer prisoner's dilemma kind of thing. And then what we manipulated across conditions was institutional quality. So in the sort of low quality institution, it's just this repeated public goods game. There's no institution in place sort of incentivizing people to behave well. And then in the high quality institution, we told them that there was an inspection mechanism, and we said there's a 20% chance in each round that your contribution is going to get inspected. And if you are inspected, then you get fined 1.5 points for every point that you kept for yourself. And so basically this is just modeling in general institutions that say, hey, are you being cooperative? If not, we're gonna impose some sanctions on you. And so they do this for 10 rounds, either with the bad institution or the good institution. And then in the second stage, you say, okay, now either play a dictator game, so just here's some money, how much do you want to give to another random person? Or a third-party punishment game, like here's someone that acted selfishly, do you want to pay to punish them or not? And so if this difference in prosociality across cultures is about the fact that basically behavior that's incentivized winds up getting internalized and then just kind of misapplied in other situations where the incentive is taken away, we should see that getting people to cooperate more in the first stage by imposing this institution on them should make them more pro-social subsequently, that they sort of get them in the habit of being pro-social. But it shouldn't really affect the amount of punishment they engage in, because that's just like a different kind of social behavior that's not cooperating, it's punishment. And so just to show that this institution worked in the first stage, now I want to show you the amount that people cooperated in each round of the first game. And so in the low-quality institution, where there's no inspection mechanism, you see a standard tragedy of the commons type thing, like in Benedict's cross-cultural experiments that I showed you, where they start reasonably cooperative, and then things break down over time. But with the good, high-quality institution, where there's this inspection mechanism keeping people honest, sort of, they start out already much more cooperative because they anticipate the possibility of getting punished, and then they just keep being cooperative as a result. So, by the end, the people from the good institution are cooperating like twice as much as the people from the bad institution. And the question is, now what happens in the second stage where we say, okay, new rules, there's no more inspection, there's no more external incentive to do anything, just like in the case of the dictator game, how much money do you want to give to some random stranger? And you see that the people that sort of got used to cooperating here are substantially more pro-social than the people that got used to sort of defecting here and who are more selfish. And so this sort of supports this spillover thing. And then also, we can say, this was again done with Americans, and as we were arguing in all the sort of previous slides, the Americans are sort of in general living under good institutions in their daily life, where there is strong rule of law and there is high market integration and all of that. So I'm sort of thinking about this high institutional quality condition as a model of the good real-world institution situation that people are used to. Whereas this is saying, what happens basically if you take Americans and put them in a bad institution, and then it makes them more selfish afterwards. But as additional support for the idea that this good institution is an effective model of what people's daily life behavior is, we can compare these two levels of prosociality to what happens if you just have people play the dictator game without doing anything beforehand. And so there you're imagining that rather than being conditioned by one of these two experimental institutions, they're just reflecting the conditioning of their daily life institution. And what you see is that baseline giving in the US in this setup is about 38%, which is more or less exactly the same as what you get coming out of the good high-quality institution. And so this is suggesting that these US MTurk participants are used to functioning in a situation where there is a good institution which makes them inclined to be pro-social in general, but when they find themselves even spending 5 minutes basically operating under a situation where there's a bad institution that has a sort of immediate impact on their just general desire to help strangers. Conversely, you don't see any effect on punishment, which again makes sense because punishment is not being pro-social, it's some other thing. So whatever, because I don't have that much time, I'm not going to belabor the punishment point, but the key idea here is that because the US has high quality institutions, subjects are pro-social at baseline, and so exposure to low-quality institutions undermines that pro-sociality. But so if, in order for the, and so that's, consistent with my argument, but it could just be that it's, easier to destroy cooperation than to build it or whatever, and so if we really want to support this story that exposure, sort of experimental exposure to good versus bad institutions moves you around relative to your baseline, we want to do the same thing in a country that has weak institutions and comparatively low baseline levels of pro-sociality. And so we did that by using the Busara lab in Kenya, which is this lab that this Princeton economists built in Nairobi for running these kind of behavioral economics experiments. And they have this big subject pool. You can recruit college students if you want, but most of the subjects that they get there are really quite low-income Kenyans, a very low education, low income, and in a country that is has much more corruption and much weaker institutions than the U.S. And so the question is, if we do that same thing here, what does it look like? And so stage one is again the same thing, this public goods game with or without the inspection mechanism. And just because we had them in the lab, we could do it longer, so we ran it for 40 rounds instead of 10 rounds. But basically, you see more or less the same thing, that when there's a chance of punishment in the public goods game, they contribute more to the public good. When there's no punishment, they learn to defect. So that is the same. And now the key question is, what happens in the second stage where you have them do this dictator game, just unilaterally dividing money with some stranger? And so in addition, so we have the people that came out of the good institution do a dictator game, the people that came out of the bad institution do a dictator game, and then we also have one set of people that just do the dictator game without doing anything beforehand, to measure their kind of baseline pro-sociality based on the daily life institutions. And what you see is that they're much less so their baseline is quite low, only about 10% of the endowment being given. And when you compare that to the experimental conditions, the baseline looks the exact same as the low-quality institution. And the high-quality institution, they're giving almost twice as much. And so that's saying, something like, in this case, maybe there's 20 or 30 minutes exposure to a set of institutional rules that incentivize good behavior in this type of domain, lead to a sort of immediate increase in their subsequent pro-sociality. Now, I'm sure that this didn't last that long, because then they go back, either the sort of bad effect, or the good effects here, or the bad effects on the American, because as soon as our experiment ends, they go back into daily life and start getting retreated by their sort of standard institution. But this is sort of experimental evidence that the type of institution that you're exposed to can have a really profound impact on the way that you act towards, how pro-social you are towards strangers in situations where there aren't any incentives to actually be pro-social. And so this story is really fundamentally, it's a very developmental story, right? It's saying the world in which you grow up influences the way that you see what are appropriate behaviors and how you act. And so this is something that we would not expect, wouldn't expect these differences to be immediately apparent at birth, but are something that should emerge over the course of development. And so the question is there evidence of that? And this is this really cool paper by Peter Blake and Katie McCullough, which, as you may recall from the kids lecture, remember they had this setup where they would set up either fair or unfair allocations, and then let the people, one of the two kids either accept the allocation, in which case they each got so if this kid accepted, he would get 1 Skittle, and the guy would get 4 Skittles, or he can reject it, in which case neither of them get any Skittles. And so this is this way of measuring to what extent do people dislike disadvantageous inequity aversion, so the other person having more than them, which even the capuchins with the cucumbers disliked. So that seems like a very deep thing that is deeply rooted behavior. And then you could also ask, how do they feel about advantageous inequity? That is, this sort of unfair situation where they're doing better than the other person. And that was something that, in the data that I showed you for the American kids in the previous class, that didn't, initially younger kids were perfectly happy to get more than the other person, and was only around age 8 that they started saying, hey, that's not fair. like, things should be different. And so they ran the same setup with kids from a whole bunch of different countries. And so on this axis is age. And so here, this is the frequency of rejection as a function of age for equal trials. And there you see that basically there's no change over age, and in all countries, nobody is rejecting equal trials, which is good and makes sense. And now, what about the case where the other person has more than you? So this disadvantageous inequity aversion condition, what you see is basically there's some variation initially, but basically across cultures, you see the same trajectory where as kids get older, they get less and less willing to accept unfairness, and this kind of lack of cultural variation across cultures is suggestive that this may not be a culturally specific thing, but just some more kind of hard-coded, ingrained behavior. But now if we look at advantageous inequity aversion, again, there's no rejecting of the equal trials, but now in the ones where you have more than the other kid, and are you willing to say, no, that's not fair, I don't want to get more than the other kid, you see a substantial divergence across cultures where in some of the countries you get the emergence of this preference for fairness in that domain, where in other countries you don't. And I'm not exactly sure why Uganda is in here, but there at least is a correlation with the quality of the institutions in that in the U.S. and Canada you get this big, and Uganda, you get this big increase, whereas in other places like India, Mexico, Peru, Senegal, you don't. So this is evidence that these things do develop over time, in particular in the domain of this more pro-social, like not just a retaliation, I don't want you to do better than me, but just like I want things to be, I want things to be fair. So taking all of this together, first of all, there's clear cross-cultural variation in cooperation and punishment behaviors, variation across small-scale societies, across different large-scale societies, even within societies, and the extent to which people are pro-social in these games is correlated with institutional quality and also responds to experimental manipulations of institutional quality, such that higher institutions seem to lead to better, to more pro-social behavior, which suggests that at least part of the sort of stable differences across cultures in people's inclination to be pro-social is the result of the internalization of the typically advantageous behavior, which varies across cultures because of differences in the institutions. And then in the problem set, you're going to see two other forces that may be other reasons that you get stable cross-cultural variation. So that's what I have to say about culture, and next class we'll talk about the evolution of religion.